it's the most appropriate way to begin this conversation today. This conversation is to remind us of whom we've come to honor today. And so I will read a brief citation of the late Professor Ben Obumselu. He was a scholar, a soldier. Professor Benedict Ebelechukwu Obumselu was a scholar, a soldier, an influential political advisor, and a public servant. In all his many guises and careers, he was always the quintessential intellectual and teacher. He was born in Oba, Nigeria in 1930 and attended Dennis Memorial Grammar School, then the University of Ibadan, where he took an honors degree in English. He went on to the University of Oxford, where he acquired a doctorate in 1960. One of the founding fathers of African literary criticism, Benedict Obumselu was an eminent scholar and a peripatetic academic. Starting his teaching career at the University of Birmingham, throughout his many different jobs and engagements, he constantly and consistently returned to academics, lecturing at universities in Zaire, DRC, Zambia, Botswana, Swaziland, Imo State, and finally St. Paul University, Oka. He was an authority on Russian and South African literature and wrote seminal articles on African writing and the influence of Marxism on it. One of Africa's most cerebral academics, his influence on poetry of Christopher Okibo is widely acknowledged. His influence on generations of students is most clearly shown through the anthology written as a tribute to his decades of academic work titled The Responsible Critic. Ben Obumselu's engagement with political activity started early as an undergraduate, where he was one of the founders and the first president of the National Union of Nigerian Students in the late 50s. On his return to Nigeria in the 60s and the start of the Civil War, he became special advisor and speechwriter to Odumegwu Ojukwu. The official war historian and record keeper, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Biafran army, involved both in the framing of the Ahiara Declaration and the collation of statements for the Onyuke Tribunal of Inquiry, amongst other activities. In the 70s, in his academic journey through Central and Southern Africa, he took a keen interest wherever possible in the local political struggles and mixed with political activists and others, and writers as well. Returning to Nigeria in the 80s, he spent the next 20 years serving in various political capacities, including as special advisor to Jim Nwobodo, Alex Ekweme, and Mahmoud Waziri. He was involved in setting the intellectual framework that underpinned the formation of both the People's Democratic Party, PDP, and the All Progressive Grand Alliance, APGA. His involvement in the politics of his beloved Igbo people included a stint as the deputy president of Ohaneze Ndigbo and serving as secretary of the Anambra State Elders Council. Benedict Obumselu was an idealist and an optimist in his intellectual conceptualization, yet always a pragmatist in his consistent determination to be politically active and inclusive. This made him the quintessential academic and public servant, inspiring and influencing younger activists, writers, and critical thinkers, many of whom are here today. From his work in the Biafra Intelligence Services, to his various roles in state governments, to his many concerted efforts to empower local governments and the grassroots in participating more fully in the political process, Ben Obumselu was always striving to move the needle forward, bringing people closer to an ideal democratic participation and inclusivity. I'd like us to take 1 minute of silence to honor the memory of the late Professor Ben Obumselu. May his soul rest in peace. Amen. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today for the inaugural Professor Ben Obumselu Memorial Lecture. I just run through his citation, and I want to welcome everyone to this great momentous occasion, one that's currently being broadcast on YouTube. The link has now been shared in the chat box, and we'll kick off very quickly with a tribute to Professor Ben Obumselu by Isidore Diala, Professor of African Literature at Imo State University, Owerri, and a former student of the late Professor Ben Obumselu. Professor, over to you, sir.
I wish to thank the organizers of this lecture for the privilege to introduce Professor Ben Obumselu to this distinguished audience. I was a second-year student at Abia State University, Uturu, Nigeria in 1983 when I met Ben Obumselu for the first time. His first lecture was all that he needed to demonstrate his distinction in the league of particularly gifted and devoted academics we had in the university then, drawn from across the world. Prodigiously gifted, extraordinarily learned, Obumselu was the wish fulfillment of every ambitious student's deepest dream of the intellectual muse. He, moreover, had a personal charm that endeared him to his students. The compulsion to know him better and the yearning to get closer to him were born on the occasion of that first meeting. Obumselu was a pioneer student in the honors degree program in English in the University College Ibadan under the headship of Professor Mole Mahood. He later proceeded to Oxford University in the United Kingdom for his doctorate. On his return from Oxford, Obumselu taught briefly at the University of Ibadan before relocating at the onset of the Civil War to the University of Biafra, as the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, was then called. Fleeing the country at the end of the war because of his pivotal services to Biafra, Obumselu led the life of a wandering scholar and taught in universities in England, Zambia, Ghana, the Congo, and Swaziland. His devotion to research was exemplary, typically encyclopedic in its speculative resonance, characterized by analytic rigor, scholarly precision, and consummate phrasing. Obumselu's publications especially focus on the dialectic of cultures. Regarding cultures as necessarily alive, dynamic, and exogamous, he methodically explored the history of a great diversity of literatures, sculpture, music, languages, religions, and other human endeavors to contend that the mystic of national culture is a 20th century misconception. Acknowledging no cultural frontiers himself, he regarded his patrimony as the entire baggage of humankind, which his genius could subject to an original and life-enhancing synthesis. Yet, Obumselu exemplified the integration of the contemplative life with the active. As an undergraduate at Ibadan, he was president of the Students' Union in the 1955-56 academic session and the first president of the National Union of Nigerian Students, NUNS, in the 56-57 session. In Biafra, he assumed roles that went beyond the writing of some of the new nation's key documents, including crucial speeches for the Biafra leader, General Odumegwu Ojukwu. It was indeed Obumselu who was commissioned to set up the separate Biafra army formation known as the S Brigade. He rose to the rank of a colonel in the Biafra army. In Nigerian politics, Obumselu always worked in the back room. He was advisor to a governor of Anambra State, played crucial roles in the formation of both the PDP and APGA, and was speechwriter and the leader of the campaign teams of two presidential candidates, Alhaji Mahmoud Waziri and later Chief-elect Ekwueme. Much later, he was Deputy President General of the Pan-Igbo organization, Ohaneze Ndigbo, and Secretary of the Anambra State Elders Council. At other times, he worked as a publisher or as a journalist, among many other roles. Yet, he expressed special preference for the vocation of the university teacher, and so unsurprisingly returned to Paul University in Awka, Nigeria, as professor of English in the final years of his life. This background amply justifies the choice of the keynote lecture, The Intellectual and Public Service in 21st Century Africa, by the renowned novelist Chimamanda Adichie. As scholar, critic, entrepreneur, soldier, statesman, counselor, journalist, speechwriter, intellectual muse, and much more, Obumselu was demonstrably motivated not by the desire for material gain or fame, but to transform the weave and texture of our common lives. In his personal life, as in his scholarship, he was steadfast in equating self-sacrificial leadership with symbolic death, and saw that as the route to objective immortality. Thus, Professor Ben Obumselu will continue to compel our attention and our reverence, because like the best of our species, his work deepens our understanding of life as an experience of value in spite of the mortality of the human condition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Isidore Diala. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge of Professor Ben Obumselu. Thank you for reading his citation as well. We're going to move on very quickly to our keynote address to be delivered by someone I absolutely love and respect. It's not enough, if I could just say a few words, it's not enough to speak about her awards or to speak about her prowess as a writer. It's not enough to speak about who she is. I think what resonates more for me as a young Nigerian is how she's able to inspire. And I draw this, most recently from her speech at the recent NBA conference in Lagos, where she started by saying, young people don't have a lot of heroes to look up to. We are lacking heroes to look up to. And I think that's what makes this conversation today really interesting. That's what makes this conversation today really urgent. We're discussing the intellectual and public service in 21st century Africa. And who else to deliver the keynote address at this occasion than the one and only Chimamanda Adichie. Please let's welcome her to deliver her address.
Thank you, Chioma. I just want to start by sending my love to Chima Obumselu, my dear friend, and to Ife, his sister. I had heard and read quite a bit about Professor Ben Obumselu. And I often told Chuma that I wanted to go and visit his father. I wanted to go and greet him. I wanted to go and sit at his feet and learn from him. And in the way that we often think that there is time, I just kept thinking I would go at some point, and then I never did. And then I got the very sad news that he had passed away in 2017. And my sadness was made greater by thinking about the fact that we're losing a generation that I find quite admirable in many ways, and a generation from whom I fear that we have not learned enough. And it also brings to me a kind of melancholy in imagining a public space where ideas and visions are traded and debated, which very much existed for that generation, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, all across this continent. And that politicians of the day were often considered intellectuals. Azikiwe, Senghor, Nkrumah, Awolowo, Mandela, of course, Oliver Tambo. And so this kind of melancholy, which is also kind of a nostalgia for me, is compounded by the fact or the realization that it would be quite a stretch to consider most of the political leaders in Africa today as intellectuals. In fact, I think the idea of the public intellectual today is in a bit of is falling into a kind of disrepute, thanks, I think, to many of the nationalist movements all over the world, and also, of course, to the former president of the United States. And so these movements, this sort of populist movements, seem to ridicule and ignore the idea of learning and knowledge, and instead celebrate ignorance and uninformed prejudice. I cannot help but wonder, though, why they have succeeded, why they are succeeding, and whether perhaps public intellectuals have failed at speaking to the public in a way that resonates with the public. I think historically on this continent, we have a strong tradition of public intellectualism. And I mean going way, way back, pre-colonial times even. And so for me, this idea of public intellectualism is that we value learning, and that we value learning from people who we consider learned. And the whole goal of that is to bring about some kind of improvement in society. I think that our respect for old age on this continent is in many ways linked to the respect for wisdom. We respect the old because we know we are likely to learn from the old. And it brings to mind that saying that when an old man dies in Africa, which is like the library being burned down. There's actually another saying that is even more popular, which is when an old woman dies in Africa, it is like 2 libraries being burned down. But there's a potential problem with this, I think, which is our respect and our reverence for age can also be a problem in this marketplace of ideas of the public intellectual, because, and this happens quite a bit in Nigeria, where you have people who resist criticism and use their age as an army. So they will say, I'm older than you, therefore you cannot say that I did something wrong. And so while, of course, I think it is wonderful that we have such reverence for age, it's also important to think about how it can be potentially an obstacle. And so in thinking about the meaning of the public intellectual, I revisited an essay called The American Scholar by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote it in 1837, and in it he considered the meaning and the function of an intellectual. So he dwelt on this concept of the one man, by which he meant a complete person, or the person who embodies all dimensions of human potential and human possibility. The professor, the scholar, the statesperson, the soldier, the business person, the artist. The intellectual is this whole person, this whole thinking person. Emerson's intellectual preserves great ideas, communicates them, creates new ideas. And so this one person, this complete person, becomes the world's eye. And very importantly, communicates these ideas to the world and not just to fellow intellectuals. Emerson's intellectual, while enriched by the past, should not be bound by books. His or her important activity is action. In fact, Emerson wrote that inaction was cowardice. I think this is a very strong statement, and I don't agree with its literal sense. Many intellectuals are not by nature combative or confrontational, nor should they be. I do agree that action is an integral part of being a public intellectual. And by action, I mean writing, speaking. But we also need to realize that in many parts of this continent, that kind of action has in fact real-world dangerous consequences. And so it's not a surprise that some individuals might want to speak out, and then they have their family, friends, and their loved ones telling them to keep quiet. The intellectuals described by Emerson do all of these things not out of a desire for recognition by society, but out of an obligation to themselves. Actions that they believe serve the public interest, that contribute to society, that can bring about positive change of some sort. That is part of being this one person, this complete person, this thinking person. Professor Ben Obumselu was a complete person. His life, his legacy was defined by action. I think it's very telling that he was the first president of the National Union of Nigerian Students. Now, before the war, he was forced to leave his job and to return to the Southeast because as an Igbo man, his life was in danger. And then during the war, he worked in intelligence, he was on the battlefield, and he was a speechwriter for the head of state, Ojukwu. He worked as an advisor to a number of political leaders, Alex Kweme, Mahmoud Basiri, Jean Mobodo, and of course, Ojukwu. And to these actions of a thinking, complete person, he added a wonderful Pan-Africanism. He worked in Zambia, in Swaziland, in Congo, and it's a kind of Pan-African spirit that feels beautifully retro to me, kind of like those faded sepia photographs from the heady days of newly independent African states. And so when we think of public intellectuals, I think it's very easy to run the risk of conflating public intellectuals with academics. And I think that the public intellectual does not have to be an academic. And in fact, that there are many academics who are not public intellectuals. And I would say that for me, one characteristic of a public intellectual, and maybe one way of distinguishing between a public intellectual and an academic, is language, the kind of language they use. A public intellectual must have lucid and clear language that is utterly free of jargon, because the goal of a public intellectual is not to talk to colleagues who themselves are specialized in some particular area of academic inquiry, but the goal is to talk to the general public in such a way as to elicit a response. And you cannot elicit a response from the public if the public does not understand what you're saying. I'm also struck by the difference between academic writing of the 1960s and academic writing today. And it suggests to me that 50 years ago, perhaps, academia itself was more suited to public engagement. The prose in the writing is often limpid and lucid. And for me, a wonderful example of that is Professor Kenneth Dike's work, which is an inspiration to me. Emerson put it well when he wrote that the public intellectual should be our eyes. Sometimes we're so immersed in our own society as to be blinded by it, and we don't see what to someone with a measure of distance would be obvious. An intellectual becomes our eyes by constantly having this measure of distance and telling us those things that we should see but don't. Recently, a few days ago, Professor Shoyinka, who for me is a wonderful idea of an example of a public intellectual, said something very pithy where during an interview he said, why prescribe IPOB and not Nieti Allah? And just in that little sentence, I think he, in a very concise and very clear way, understandable to everyone, he showed this idea of a governmental double standard. I think, and I'm going to talk about Nigeria in particular, that a public intellectual should imagine our future, should give us context for the present, and most of all, should draw from our past. And this is why I think that in Nigeria today, we need historians or people who are familiar with history to engage more actively in public life. The media will often bring us news with absolutely no historical context. I was recently reading reports in well-regarded publications about the recent elections in Kenya, and I was struck by how often there was no mention of Raila Odinga's past involvement in Kenyan politics, his past positions, or even his past runs for president. I think it is important to fully understand the context of a story. And even the election of our present president in Nigeria, I felt the entire process was very strangely disengaged from history. There was no proper public sustained interrogation of his time as a military dictator. It was only the present, where we were told that he was now a reformed Democrat, and that was all that mattered. Now, I think, would it have made a difference if we had people actively interrogating and also factually interrogating his past? I want to think so. I want to think that it would have made a difference. But of course, it's easy to think about these things in retrospect. And there are many other examples. I mean, maybe I shouldn't get too political. I think the public intellectual, the giving us a sense of history is important. And in doing that, it's possible for us to hold leaders accountable. And so, for example, hold leaders accountable not just for past actions, but also for past positions that they've taken. And this is not to say that we should then insist that people are eternally yoked to their past positions, because of course, leaders should change their minds, in the face of new information, in the face of intellectual growth. And I've always felt a little bit sort of leery of that the American media will often accuse a politician of flip-flopping when a politician has changed that politician's mind. And in my thinking, it can in fact be a good thing, because perhaps they have grown, learned something. But I think in Nigeria, we just don't have a tradition of that. We don't have a tradition of holding public figures, particularly political leaders, accountable for past positions that they have taken. Simply to say to them, this is a past position that you had. Do you still agree with it? What is your position now? And in that way, I think we as a public, as a society, we're better able to gauge whether we want such a person to be a political leader. I think a public intellectual who is familiar with history, who is alert to history, who is aware of history, can also remind us that unity is possible. Because unity was once shown to be possible. And so by doing that, perhaps illuminate to us that the problem is not so much that Nigeria is multi-ethnic, but that Nigerian leaders have failed at making every group feel fully included in this multi-ethnic arrangement that we call Nigeria. So public intellectuals should educate us. I think today there's a lot of, in the public space, in the public discourse, there's a lot of outrage, as there should be, because there's so much to be outraged about. But often, not a lot of understanding of the mechanisms of civic engagement. So how does the government actually work? How can a citizen actually engage? I wish I would advocate for ways in which we can get public intellectuals to engage more with these issues, to engage more with educating us. Professor Pat Utomi, who I think is a wonderful example of a public intellectual, said this kind of off the cuff a few days ago when he was speaking. He said, and he was talking about restructuring, devolution of powers, how we needed a proper, how we needed to have less power concentrated at the center. And he said about the states, they just sit there, wait for allocation, pay salary, and then enjoy the rest. And for me, this very, very concise, very casual statement, he had explained in many ways the problem of the structure that we have in Nigeria today. And so I think many of us, I certainly would benefit from having public intellectuals who, in clear language, educate us about how things actually work. And I think also it would help if those public intellectuals were numerically literate, because I think, again, that there is a tendency in public discourse for people to throw out numbers that have no context and make no sense. So you have young people who will say things like, so and so stole 705 billion, and nobody knows, and of course we don't know, well, how much does the state make? How much does it cost to run things? So what is the context? How, in some ways, how outraged should we be? I think a public intellectual should be able to inspire people. In addition, of course, to educating us, being our eyes, the idea of reaching people, because we are all emotional beings, and in many ways, many of the decisions we make are emotional decisions. And I think the public intellectual should be able to reach that part of us that is emotional. And to do that, I think it requires a level of emotional intelligence. There is also, I think, the need to identify just fundamental issues in our society, identify them, illuminate them, make them subjects of public discourse. For example, there needs to be a redefining of the sense of public service on this continent. I think the inherited colonial model, the civil service, has failed. The independence and objectivity of the public service has been subverted by the political process. Civil servants who in times past were considered icons of independence, and this is, I think, exemplified by that expression, permanent secretary, are now either political appointees or, at best, implementers of the political priorities of the government of the day. And so, in a strange way, the private sector has now become the prominent arena in which people exercise their sense of public service. NGOs, advocacy groups, that sort of thing. And Western donors, who are still unfortunately the predominant donors on this continent, have recognized this, and so have changed from funding governments to funding private sector groups. I think that public intellectuals on this continent can play a role in reforming government, even if just by raising these questions. How do we reconstruct a new notion of public service that can address the many equities that we have in our society? And the ideas that we have about how we can, in fact, reconstruct public service cannot remain in a kind of splendid isolation, even if they're admired when they are in splendid isolation, because we need those ideas to generate a substantive response. They have to become part of the public conversation. We have to collectively, in this open public space of exchanging ideas and learning, talk and think about what things are important and what should be thought and done about those important things. Sometimes public intellectuals can become symbols, and I, for example, think of Professor Wole Soyinka and the late great Chinua Achebe as symbols of brave truth-telling. Albert Einstein, after he became famous, was asked to give public addresses on all kinds of subjects: religion, ethics, philosophy, politics. And he, in many ways, became the symbol of gentle rationality and a kind of human nobility. And I remember reading a biography of him and being actually quite moved to learn that he was actually quite shy, but he rose up to this expectation of him, that he had a platform and he used it and then became a symbol. And symbols do matter because symbols can inspire people, symbols can move people to act. But I think that a public intellectual who becomes a symbol must be aware of the limitations of his or her knowledge. That public intellectual must also acknowledge personal prejudices, should be open to criticism, should be prepared to consider all views, and then, if needed, adjust opinions in the face of superior arguments or previously unknown information. I think on this continent, the role of a public intellectual is arguably more important than in other parts of the world. We have often what we call democracies, but due to the nature of those democracies, public intellectuals often do not, or sometimes cannot, participate in those democracies actively, which means that their actions usually cannot be that of direct implementation. And so it becomes even more important that the public role of educating, of creating, of pushing public discourse becomes even more important. Their credibility, their clarity, their ability to articulate ideas become even more important. And often, I think a public intellectual gives language for ideas that people might already have. And so in that way, the public intellectual speaks for people who cannot speak for themselves. And in conclusion, I feel really happy, honored, pleased to be here, to be here celebrating a great man, Professor Ben Obumselu, and remembering, I think, for me, what's important about celebrating people who have done remarkable things is not just because they deserve to be celebrated, and they do, but also to remind us of what is possible. And so in thinking about his life and all of the things that he did as teacher, as thinker, as political advisor, as he was active in Ohanese Ndigbo as the Deputy President General. All of those things, I think, point to possibility. And so in reading about his life, I find myself thinking, there is so much that one can do, there's so much that is possible. And in this way, I think we kind of draw inspiration from him. And for that, I am very grateful. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for those words. I think a few things that jumped out for me were, first of all, you talked about the language that leaders use to speak to people, the language that intellectuals must use to address their people. And you said something about, perhaps one of the problems we have today is that the intellectuals are no longer speaking to their people. And, as a young person who's run through a lot of movements in Nigeria from 2008 with Light Up Nigeria up till 2020 End SARS and then State of Emergency GBV, sometimes you have to ask, who are these people? Who are the people in government? Who are the people in public positions? Who are they speaking to? Because it definitely feels like they're not speaking to us. So thank you very much for the reminder on the inspiration that public intellectuals should be, on the inspiration that leaders should be. Two quick questions have come on for you. So before we let you go, I'm just going to read them. The first one says, are public intellectuals modern day philosophers? And the second one is, can we really get leadership right in Nigeria? So back to you. Thank you.
The second question, yes, of course we can get leadership back right in Nigeria. Absolutely, absolutely. I've always believed this. I've often felt that you meet people in this country and you find yourself thinking, if only you would run for president, things would be much better. So we have people in this country who can make wonderful leaders. Obviously, the question is, will they get involved in politics? And because it is difficult for me, I don't know how to pretend. So, I was thinking that I should pretend to be sort of non-partisan and apolitical in this, for this lecture, but why should I? So I can say, for example, that that Peter Obi, who is a man who's running for president, is somebody I think would make a very good leader. And it's because he's shown that good leadership is possible. He's shown by example that it is in fact to be a leader. It is in fact possible in this country to be a leader without resorting to all of the things that we've come to expect, such as reliance on theft, reliance on theft of public funds. So yes, I think that we can absolutely get leadership right. There's so many other Peter Obis in this country from different parts of this country. We can. We've just had the terrible misfortune of having people who should be in positions who are in positions that they have no business being in. And maybe one of the things we should think about more is how to change the structures and the systems to make it easier for people to get involved. I'm just always horrified thinking about how much it costs when people say, oh, I got a form, and the form is, I don't know, 100 million, and it's ridiculous. So even how much money is involved in running for office in this country, I think is something that is an obstacle, and means then that the people who could be really very good leaders are prevented from becoming involved starting out. The question about whether I think public intellectuals are public philosophers, no. And I find myself a little bit wary of that expression philosopher, because again, in thinking about public intellectuals, I think it's so important to be clear. And philosophy is a wonderful subject. One of my favorite classes when I was an undergraduate was a class on, and I think it was on ethics and argument, something like that. It was a philosophy course. But I think when we start to, that idea of philosophizing can have a negative connotation. It can sometimes mean that you go on and on and on, and at the end, nobody knows what you've said. So I think I would say no, that I don't think a public intellectual is necessarily a philosopher. Could be, but I think what is central for me and what is important about what we need in our public intellectuals today is clarity.
All right. Thank you very much for those. I wonder if you have any more time for a couple more questions. We've had a couple more come in. Okay, so we'll just take them as our final round of questions for Chimamanda so that we can move to the panelists. And a few of them are, do Nigerians in the diaspora have a role to play in being public intellectuals for Nigeria? The next one says, how does one encourage public intellectualism? And then the final one says, why do I agree with you that young people need people to look up to, but there seems to be a scarcity of such people? Where do you think the young ones should look up to for mentorship? And the rest of them are comments which I'll take later as we go on.
Okay, so can you so the last one was about people to
where
look up to.
Young people find mentors, as it doesn't seem like there are any. And then the first one talked about the role of the diaspora in public intellectualism in Nigeria.
Yes, I think I don't think we should. I don't think we should exclude people because they don't live in Nigeria, and especially, I think especially in this age of in this Japa age. So everyone's looking to leave because this is a country that has become increasingly inhospitable, and so I think making the choice to leave because, for example, you want your children to have a better education that you can afford. Is not a reason to be excluded from participating in what's happening in your country. So my answer would be no, but at the same time I would say, and this is my own personal prejudice, that I'm a deep believer in local knowledge. And so I find, for example, that I learn a lot more about Nigerian politics and how things work when I talk to people who are, so to speak, on ground. And that it makes a difference. But I think when you're outside of Nigeria, there's also a distance that can be quite useful. And so I think, yes, that people have different things to contribute. So I would not at all agree that we should somehow say, because you live in the diaspora, you cannot, you don't get to say anything about what's happening. I think the second question about how to encourage this, I would say by learning, by reading. I have many, I think my biggest pet peeve about our country and the way that we seem to function is that there's a kind of intellectual curiosity that schools do not encourage, society does not encourage, that we're not encouraged to kind of find out, to learn, to go beyond the minimum. And so I find young people who sometimes I just find myself sort of, telling them, wanting to shake them and say, pay attention to the detail, find out more, go 2 steps further, learn, ask questions, learn how things actually work. Someone was saying recently to me, the rich people just send their children to schools in Switzerland. And I thought, really? I mean, how do you know this? Have you actually looked to see? And it's easy to find out, have you got, you can search for things online. You don't just say things that in some ways have become cliches and often are just not grounded in any reality. So I think the way to encourage this idea of public intellectualism is to celebrate and make a priority the idea of learning. And by learning, I don't really mean school learning. I mean a kind of broad, roving intellectual curiosity. Just wanting to know things, wanting to learn things, asking things, in some ways practicing a kind of useful ameboism. And the question about people to look up to, I mean, I'm also looking for people to look up to. So I'm searching everywhere. Again, I think that there are, right? I think that there are people in this country doing so many good things, but the problem is they're not amplified. Their work is not amplified. We don't get to see them. And I know how I've been inspired by just somehow and sometimes accidentally finding out about what Nigerians are doing, and you just think, my goodness, this is just really incredible. So maybe one thing I would suggest is for the young people who are involved, who are in the media, to find those people. So someone sent me a video recently about this woman who's a Danfo driver. And I think it was from BBC Pidgin. And I was so inspired by her, by her just matter of factness and her ambition and her courage. And I remember thinking, this video would be good for many, many young women and men in this country to see possibility, because heroes don't have to be quote unquote big men and big women. But I think, yes, that they're there, we have to find them. But I also think that we should try, each of us personally, to be that hero that we want. It's important to also look in the mirror and say, how am I doing? Right? There are young people who criticize corruption in this country, and sometimes I'm watching them and I'm thinking, what would you do if you were in that position? Are you upset only because you don't get to get a slice of this national cake? Are you upset because you think fundamentally it is wrong that this cake is being squandered?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those responses, and thank you for sharing your time with us today. I know that more questions and comments around what you spoke about around your keynote will come in the course of the conversation. So hopefully you're able to stay with us for another hour. The event will be over by 6 p.m. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. I am a fan, as you can tell.
Thanks, Chioma.
I'm going to move on very, very quickly to the rest of the panel. We're going to have a big discussion now, just taking the topic, the intellectual, the public intellectual in the 21st century, especially as it concerns Nigeria. And to discuss this with us today, to share contributions, we have a number of people. The first of them is lawyer and human rights activist, Ayo Obe. We also have writer, visual artist, filmmaker, Mudi Yahaya. We have poet, dramatist, linguist, and literary critic, Professor Niyi Osundare. And we have one more person that I'm not going to miss. We have Distinguished Professor of African Studies and Emeritus Professor of English, Professor Dan Izevaye. So we're going to start with human rights activist and lawyer Ayo Obe. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chioma, for putting me first again. I was on a panel on Tuesday and I specifically told the moderator, don't put me first as the first discussant. And he deliberately put me first. So that's why I've been begging for the agenda all this time. And partly because when I was invited to participate in this discussion, I questioned, what do I have to do with intellectuals? I don't know about intellectuals. And quite frankly, the events of this week, where we saw the Nigerian Bar Association, who also heard a very inspiring address from your own keynote speaker, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And the discussion was about, yes, this is a gathering of intellectuals, blah, 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 blah. And then after that, we saw, after I had participated in a panel on etiquette and ethics, we had the very distressing sight of Nigerian lawyers scrambling for conference bags. So the meaning of the word intellectual has its problems for me. But if it's a matter of people who think about issues and have some ideas to contribute, whether they are new or old, I'm not necessarily a big fan of saying that because something is not a new idea, it doesn't merit being taken out, looked at, dusted over, and regurgitated. But to the extent of thinking about issues, I think that part of why the public intellectual or the role of the intellectual in public life is difficult is because we have lost the capacity for nuance. It may be that it's the lawyer in me who always wants to lead. When somebody says, everybody is, for example, as Chimamanda just said, everybody wants to japa. I said, no, they don't. And if I give evidence that everybody wants to, and then somebody presents me with two people who don't, does that mean that my statement is has been rendered invalid? So I tend to be a bit loyally cautious about these absolutes. Everybody has done this. We meet every Saturday in Lagos to remind the government that we have 103 Chibok girls who are still missing. And some people will say, oh, everybody has forgotten about the Chibok girls. Nobody is talking about them anymore. And I look at the sort of dozen or so people who may turn out on any given Saturday. And I said, well, there are some of us who are still here. So we're not everybody. It's not that everybody has forgotten. It may be true that some big names such as the former First Lady of the United States is not holding up her Bring Back Our Girls poster, but she is nonetheless. That doesn't mean to say that the rest of those who are still involved are not anybody, though we may not be everybody. So I have that issue. I think that the public intellectual, or that the intellectual, needs to retain that capacity for nuance. And I should say this because my preferred form of interaction these days, apart from pontification on radio, television, and so on, is through Twitter. And there you do find people coming up with these everybody, nobody type of statements, nothing is being done, and so on. And I do try to push back against it to introduce nuance all the time. But I think that also when it comes to there's this tendency, as the keynote speaker said, to want to say, well, what have you done? What is your practical impact? Where do we see your feeling? And I remember when I started out in practice, which is more than 40 years ago, I was in the chambers of G.O.K. Ajayi, SAN. And I remember asking him once that, you see other people who are, even if they're in banking, what they're doing, they're dealing in creating wealth or helping other people to create wealth. You see manufacturers, they're making things. You see farmers, they're growing their crop. What is it that we lawyers Yeah, I know that we lawyers are involved in separating our helping people to solve their disputes or to get redress where they have been wronged. But where do we have what is it that we're contributing to the nation? And his answer was centered around the rule of law and why it was important that we have that bedrock to fall back on. It may not be that we always live up to it, and certainly we can see from not just the profession, but the arbiters of the profession and so on. We can see that not everybody adheres to it, but nonetheless, that is the goal to which we aspire. So I would say that there is there's a need to understand what our role may not be something that you can count in terms of something produced, cars produced, tubers of yam grown, money in the bank, but it is something that we would have to contribute. Part of the reason why I was asking for the agenda 2 is to try and remember how long I'm supposed to talk for. So I hope the moderator is going to signal to me at some point where I stop. But can I just perhaps round up my own initial thoughts by saying that because of the lack of nuance that has come to public life, particularly with the advent of social media, I think that the intellectual, particularly the one who wants to be a public intellectual, is struggling for space, struggling for public attention in the same way that everybody else is. Whether you are a contestant on Big Brother Nigeria, you may indeed have a PhD stuck in your back pocket, but on Big Brother Nigeria, that is not going to get you your agenda. I'm speaking as somebody who's never watched it, let me say this, but that's my impression of it. And so you do find people saying things like what Chimamanda quoted Tommy as saying, that about the state governments or local governments. And I thought, well, that's obviously not true. It's obviously not the case that everybody just sits, collects their money and pays salaries. But if you want to make the statement that will catch attention and get the clicks, I suppose, if you are in the business of getting clicks, then you have to say something a little bit outrageous, a little bit lacking in nuance or completely lacking in nuance, and then people will stop and listen to you. You may then have the opportunity to flesh out what you wanted to say, to give it that shade and nuance. But I would say that for me, the biggest issue that is facing us is because of the tendency of these absolutes, everybody, nobody, and so on, to divide us and to make it seem as though there is only one path and you're either on it or off it. I think that I would urge that we do stick to nuance, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. I think, like you, I wondered at the lawyers at the MBA conference. I myself have spoken at the MBA conference, I think in 2019, and to see that happen, the scramble for bags was a little shocking. But thank you very much for your comments today, and thank you for the questions that you've thrown at us just for deeper reflection on public intellectualism. I'm going to move on now to our next contributor, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a writer, he's a journalist that everyone knows, everyone talks about, Mr. Dele Olojede. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chioma. I'm delighted to join with all my friends, old and new, on this panel, and particularly excited to see the smiling face of Chimamanda on screen. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. I wanted to make a couple of comments on partly what our keynote speaker said, and partly sort of my own ruminations about where we are. This is a country that no matter how much you want to feel alienated from it, like the character in The Godfather, it keeps pulling you back in. So what are we to do but to try to figure out a way to chart a clearer path forward so that we can create, perhaps at long last, a country in which human flourishing is the top of our agenda. So Chimamanda, you had mentioned something about the public intellectuals serving as an inspiration. And I think that is extraordinarily important because it caused me to reflect a little bit on my own childhood when I was growing up in Ife. And at that time, just being born at the right time, I suppose, due to no fault of mine, one was inserted in this university town and the surrounding Nigerian environment into a cultural milieu that basically signaled to you that you were supposed to mean something, that you were supposed to matter. We would go to theater on Sundays to Riolokun for free as children because all the great playwrights who had congregated at Ife at the time will first test out their plays before it goes on the road at the local theater, which was open to us for free. And that time in the 60s, Wole Soyinka was this orbital figure with so many moons around him. And whether we went to see, King Christoph or Our Husband Has Gone Mad Again, or the premiere of Death and the King's Husband at the opening of Oduduwa Hall at the University of Ife in 1976. All of these things without anyone announcing it to you, to say nothing of the theater troops, Ogunde, the comedian Baba Salah, Drew Oladipo, and the staging of all these extraordinary plays around the old Oyo Empire and the fate of kings and so on. All these things without anyone saying it. If you were a 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year-old child growing up in that environment, you sort of knew that the world belonged to you and that you had a role to play in it. And so my own journey was actually built surreptitiously by all these people and all these influences that created the idea of a public intellectual in my mind, which, as I grew up, I then tried to model myself around. So that quality of inspiration is absolutely essential, both for individuals growing up in a society, as well as the wider society itself, that wherever things are broken, there should always be voices that point us in a different direction. This has always been true. It's worth restating, but it is a fact of human existence and especially human progress that the public intellectual had always helped us to see. They're like our seeing-eyed dogs that lead us out of the darkness. I mean, the Russians, of course, their operatically tragic history clearly demonstrates the centrality of the role of public intellectuals in helping them to see clearly what was wrong with them, whether it was feudal Russia or authoritarian and murderously autocratic regimes during the communist era. And America at its founding, I mean, the Federalist Papers were largely written by Alexander Hamilton. And then you're reading speeches, whether it's a piece of writing like Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham City jail, or more importantly, Frederick Douglass, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. All these things were the work of great intellectuals who helped the public to refocus on what was of essence at that moment and where a society was going wrong and needed to find its way. So the problem for us in Nigeria is not so much that we don't share the same history, because we do. There is nothing exceptional about us, for good or ill, in that sense. So, I mean, Achebe literally predicted a military coup in A Man of the People. helped us to see before the rest of us could, that the way the country was going, it was almost inevitable that that was where we were going to end up. So we were always part of that tradition as well. And so the question though now is, if as probably 80 or 90% of the Nigerian population accounts for this, that if you were not born at the time that I was born, which sort of dates me a little bit, then you probably were not born at the right time. But there is always a new day to create a new right time for other people. And that's what's interesting about the brokenness and fragmentation of our country today, that in fact, out of this exceptional rot, the people who lead us out of this moment, which is not going to be people my age, is going to be more people like our keynote speaker and younger people than her, who would help us figure a way forward. Maybe we have slipped into the advisory periods of our lives, where when advice is sought, we might offer it, but not before then, to help us think through this central question in my mind: what is the Nigeria idea? What is that idea of us that helps us to transcend really dispiriting divisions along ethnicity and religion and region and wealth or poverty, all the things that have made us a lot coarser than we need to be? And what is the Nigerian idea? Is it something bigger than these frontiers that had been constructed for us by faceless men in Berlin more than a century ago? Is it in fact an African idea? What it is that we think of ourselves and our inherent value as human beings in congregation around what is defined as a society, and therefore how do we make the efforts required to construct such a society? I think we need that clarity in our minds, and the centrality of public intellectuals leading us to that space, to me, is obvious but worth restating. Finally, I will say that one of the many errors of my way that I have learned to define more clearly upon further reflection as I remove myself from the aggravations of everyday life, is that a public intellectual, whether self-described or seen by others, may sometimes develop a tunnel vision. And what might seem to be good ideas end up either failing us outright or not living to its fullest potential. And I will illustrate that very briefly with our experience of Next. So when I started putting together in concert with others the idea of Next, the idea of Next was to look at a country that was so broken, so decrepit, that if you simply demonstrated a small example of excellence, which did not rely on the old divisions along gender or religion and so on, and which was not at any rate dependent on the vast corrupt networks that are so dominant in our country, that example might show other people that actually, you know, it's really possible here to be able to attain excellence and to do it with your moral foundations intact. The second assumption was that Nigerian people, or somebody said, you know, the dirty little secret of democracy is the people, but that the Nigerian people had been so fed bad, self-serving information that if we honestly presented them with the facts, they will use it to arm themselves to make better decisions as individuals and as collectives to build a better country. Now, that turned out to be a fallacy because people do not act simply on facts. In fact, as we all know from throughout intellectual history, you know, reason is the servant of the emotions. We fail to see that you had to somehow find a way to connect facts to people's hearts in order to get them to act upon it. So by the time we got around to understanding that if you said the Minister of Petroleum had stolen $8 billion, these are just numbers to the vast majority of Nigerian people. But you had to be able to say, this is how many teachers you were denied, or how many policemen, or the garbage in your neighborhood not picked up, or the roof of your children's school not rebuilt or repaired. That it's only by trying to do that, connecting things that generates a heartfelt reaction from people might give you a better chance. But I just thought, because I come from a world of facts throughout my professional life, that was in and of itself sufficient. It turns out that it is not. So, but that can be mitigated by the possibility of having diverse and many voices, particularly high quality ones, because one of the terrible things that social media has done to us, even though it has also given people the freedom to be, is that it has equalized all voices. And we all know that not all voices are equal, just from human experience, and certainly not all equal on all things. And this vast equalization perhaps has, in some degree, diminished the importance and the seriousness with which the work of a public intellectual should be considered. But it's just up to us then to find new words, to find new ways of reaching people in a way that they can respond. And it's no use being simply frustrated that these people are too damaged or too far gone, because there's no such thing. The human capacity for change is very nearly infinite. And for that, I remain hopeful, particularly that the generation behind us, and definitely the generation behind them, have another chance to wake up in the morning and start a new day, right? Hope, after all, is why we get up in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure listening to you, sir. I remember the last time I was this close to you, but in person, was the conversation organized by Radio Now next year called Urgent Conversations. In Lagos, we were talking about the fierce urgency of now and just ways to pull Nigeria back from the brink. And I listened to you then, and I was thoroughly just inspired by what you said, and you speaking now, talking about clarity, but also the ways in which the ones who are called public intellectuals must guard against just that tunnel vision and just sitting inside their own chamber and not reflecting on what they say and how it affects other people. It's quite poignant, not just for now, but as we go forward. So thank you very much again, sir, for your comments and your contribution.
Thank you very much.
We're going to move to our next contributor right now. And we will be hearing from none other than poet, dramatist, linguist, and literary critic, Professor Niyi Osundare. Sir, you have the floor. You're muted, sir. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, I was just going to ask, how many minutes do you give me? You
have between 5 and 7 minutes, sir.
Okay, maybe we should extend it to 10. I'll try to keep to that. Very, very briefly, thank you very much to the family of Oga Ben. I remember that was what I called him the last time I spoke to him on the phone. I was in Ibadan, he was in Lagos. It is a great person we have lost, but we are happy that, as we say in Yoruba, Ogaku, Ogaku. Oga has gone, but Oga has not parted. I appreciate the effort of the family. And it's like what that young man said to Achebe upon hearing the passing of Okigbo, Daddy, don't let him die. This is a worthy effort in making sure that one of our best does not die. And I also want to thank you, the organizers. This is about the most carefully curated Zoom participation I have ever had. Yes, thank you, Chimamanda. It was good listening to you. About 2 days ago, so I also read something on the internet about your anxiety, which is the anxiety of most of us. Where are the role models? More or less like saying the young ones have no role models to look up to. That is a very complex statement indeed. I know where it is coming from, but as Professor Donatus Nwoga once told me, a whole clan cannot die. There are role models in Nigeria. We don't have enough of them, I know. I think we have to look hard. We may not even need to look hard at times. As I'm speaking to you here, I'm looking at the image of one of the people who, through whose example, I became a university teacher. Professor Dan Izebai taught me 1969 to 1972 at the University of Ibadan. And it was what I saw in him and others. In fact, it was through him I heard about Obumselu for the first time in one of his classes. And Banjo, Cheru, and all of them. And I said, come, I too would like to be a teacher. That was a time when I finished university education in 1972, I had 4 options of jobs. I said teaching. So it's like my friend Dele Olojede, yeah, we are influenced by people that we see, that people that we care for. But what do we do in a country where those people are scarce, are so scarce? We have to look and keep looking for that. Now, Dele, I would say yes. Incidentally, people used to call me the next poet. Remember, I used to do the monthly poem in Next. It was not only a dream, it was a dream for many, many of us. And we believe that that is it. Another Next is coming, either by the same name or by some other name. It is not a thing to dream. But what the contraption we call Nigeria really more or less shows to us is that it is wrong to dream and you get punished for it. Positive archetypes are in every society. These archetypes, I use that title in one of the things I did some years ago. These archetypes are archetypes because they represent more than themselves. And they are either alive or dead. So when we talk about role models, it is not just those that are here with us. Mandela remains a model. Mopugo Okoye remains a model. Ganifa remains a model. Chinua Achebe remains a model. Awolowo, Zik. These are models too. But we cannot see them, but we can feel them. Sankara, Lumumba. These are models. At times when the present is a little blurry, we have a way of bringing into service the past to really kindle our memory and guide our path to the future. So there are role models in Nigeria. If there were none, Nigeria will still be under military rule. Because, but for people like Ayo Obe, who is with us here, Beko Ransom Kuti, Olisa Ubakoba, and Falana, who keeps popping in and out of the court every day in Nigeria today. If not for such people, Nigeria will still be under military dictatorship. Yeah, there are positive models in Nigeria. We may need to look harder, but they are there. Not to do this will really be to tip to the other side. There are evil rulers in Nigeria. They are not leaders. These are rulers, wicked and rapacious, but they don't represent the Nigerian people. I would dare say, too, that they don't represent the Nigerian spirit. Now, when I got my invitation to this event, two books came to my mind straight away, pivotal books. One of them is titled Public Intellectuals, the Public Sphere, and the Public Spirit. This was a book of essays in honor of Olatunji Dare. That's one of Nigeria's best columnists. And it is edited by Wale Adebanwi. It was published in 1914. Oh, sorry, in 2014. I hope that's not a Freudian slip, 1914. Now, the second one is by my friend and brother, and one of the pillars behind the present event, Isidore Diala. And the title is The Responsible Critic, Essays on African Literature in honor of Professor Ben Obumselu. The word I'm hanging on to here is the positive modifier, responsible. There are critics and there are critics. The responsible critic. That phrase actually summarizes the essence of what we call the public intellectual. Obumselu was as cerebral, as combatively intelligent, as creative, as human as they went. But he didn't restrict himself to the classroom. He also went out there. But I want to say in 1 or 2 minutes that there was a time in human history when the phrase public intellectual would have been seen as oxymoronic, because isn't it possible for you to be an intellectual and at the same time you are public? Why? Because by the definition of the intellectual in those days, the intellectual was a person who was given to the life of introspection and reflection, who disciplined himself or herself in such a way that was monastic, and you began to wonder, does this man really eat? Does he drink at all? Almost Socratic. But current society has made this rather impossible. And I think that is what Chinua Achebe said in 1964 at the University of Leeds, when he gave that extremely important speech. The writer, the role of the writer in the African situation. It was published in 1965. What he was telling the world is, oh, we cannot be writers like our colleagues in the West and just stay in our closet. Because when our house is burning, when our roof is on fire, we cannot sit at our desk and knock the computer or, the typewriter. That was Achebe in 1965. This is to say that, yes, the work of the intellectual is extremely important, but one thing I really want us to do is the making of the intellectual. So my own question would be, who is the intellectual? And what is public service? Public service is seen by many people as, being a minister, being a governor, no. Personal example, I was offered a job by one of the Nigerian governments a couple of years ago. I turned it down. The way it was offered was insulting to me. Yes, We have dignity in Nigeria. We also have people who are not hungry. And I said, no. But what bothered me was people then went to my mother and they went to relations and people were coming, don't turn this down. This is your opportunity to eat. This is your opportunity to open doors for us. Now, there were people who said, yeah, you did right. But there were others who said, no, you have taken the wrong step. Now, here is the intellectual, here is public service. Two friends of mine came, they were my classmates. And I asked them, when they kept on saying, you are a mere critic, a mere intellectual, you will die in poverty in the university. Look, why don't you do this? And I said, no. They said, this is an opportunity for you to serve. And I told them, I have been a teacher for over 25 years. I have been serving. What is your definition of service? That is extremely important. Is it political service you're talking about, which is more or less like political jobbery as it is in Nigeria? Is it getting a place as a corporate, fat chick corporate person somewhere in the bank or whatever? Is that how to serve the country? Our country, Nigeria, has really never paid any respect to people who do the work of the brain. And I think this is why issues are the way they are. So we have to look at the society. Who is the intellectual? Some time ago, I think there's an example of that in the Olatunji Dare book. A governor was talking. I think he had fallen out with one of our intellectuals. Then he said, yeah, he was a professor, don't mind him, he had no house. And then he kept on sending me his CV, until I got him the job. I gave him money, I gave him publicity, fame, and look at what he has done now. What is the intellectual looking for? Is it money? Is it fame? Or is it the semblance of power? Because it is not real power. The sociology of the Nigerian intellectual, of the African intellectual, is also here. And the sociology of the African intellectual, the archaeology of the African, the archaeology of the knowledge of the African intellectual are both tied up with the African society. African society as it is now, and the pressures and demands that are constantly on the intellectual. I think I'm going to shut up my mouth, but I want to tap on one word: values, values, and values. What does it, we can't talk about role models, we can't talk about being an intellectual, we can't talk about public service and the relationship between the academic and without really looking, what are the values of the society? What are the values of the intellectual? What are the expectations of society about the intellectual? How does society measure the grade of success? What does it mean to be a successful woman or man in Nigeria? What does it mean to be a failure? Yes, we are not there yet, but I think we are close to it. We do not have enough we could look up to, but there are people to look up to in Nigeria. I picked up the newspaper again about 4 days ago. I saw an article by Wole Soyinka. Wole Soyinka was my teacher in the 70s at the University of Ibadan. Every government that has ruled Nigeria, he has had one issue or another with. At 87 plus, this man is still very much in the public forum. And I said to myself, now in my mid-70s, how can I say that I'm tired? Yeah, somebody to look forward to. There is no way I think about Soyinka that way that I do not think about the conversations I used to have with his friend, Chinua Achebe, when he was alive. as far as I'm concerned, Ayo Obe is with us, just as Shoyinka is with us. Well, I hope there will be one or two other things to say then, but our intellectuals do not live in a vacuum. Nigeria is the way it is because of the way Nigeria organizes its values. And last question. When Ben Obumselu and others were making waves and preparing our minds for Nigeria's independence, there were, how many universities were in Nigeria? 1. As time went on, 4 universities, then 5 universities, 6 universities. Today, must be over 120. I have lost count. How literate is Nigeria today? Nigeria is less literate today with over 120 universities than it was when it had only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 universities. So where does the intellectual fall in this? We have to zero in on the problem. There is a problem. We don't have a country yet. Nigeria is not a country. I keep saying it. It's a country I love so much, but it is not the country of our dream. It is not the country we want, but we have to make sure we find an alternative. We have to make Nigeria work. To make Nigeria work, we must make sure that we do not throw the baby out with the bath water. There are bad people in our country, but there are also good people. The same way I say, when we're talking about corruption, which is running all over the place, some people say, we are all corrupt. We are all corrupt. And I said, no, don't say that. That's defeatist. If you say you are corrupt, say it. It doesn't mean everybody in the country is like you. Again, Professor Donatus Nwoga, 1986, after my ant hill reading at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, at night, we were there, a couple of us talking. And when it was time to go, he said it in Igbo. I used to remember, I forgot it, but the translation is, a whole clan cannot die. Thank you very much for making sure that Ben Obumselu does not die. He lives and we live with him.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you so much. I think Prof has taken us through an entire class, and which is not surprising. As he says, he strives to be the kind of teacher who challenges and inspires. And he's not just challenged us today, he's reminded us of what's important, values. He's also reminded us that, you know, the public intellectual doesn't have to be a person in power, a person holding office. The public intellectual is you, the public intellectual is me. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you for taking us through this very quick lecture today. I must say it's been very instructive for me personally. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I'm now going to move to Mudi Yahaya, who is a writer, visual artist, filmmaker, and he's a writer, visual artist, and filmmaker. Mudi Yahaya is our last contributor today, and then we will have reactions from the audience. So please stick around, stay with us. We're gradually coming to the end of this very important event. We'll listen to Mudi Yahaya, we'll listen to members of the audience, and then we will call it a day. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mudi.
Thank you very much. I took notes while everybody was speaking, the keynote speaker and the other panelists, and I would like to touch on aspects of what they said. Chimamanda said that it's important to note the passing away of generations and how a lot of wisdom is being lost by their passing away, and how important history and context is in framing this question about public intellectuals. To me, the whole issue sits on 3 issues. The situation, the source of agency of a public intellectual, the cultural purchase of a public intellectual, and also the location of public intellectuals. I think these are the questions that frame how we move forward. I agree with Ms. Obe about the nuance in discussing these issues. For instance, when you speak about the source of agency, I think there's a great distrust in the agency or the source of what triggers the agencies of public intellectuals. If you remember, as Chimamanda rightly said, that there was a tradition of public intellectualism in Nigeria in the 50s and the 60s. But as we all know, intellectual kingdoms rise and fall. And so it begs the question, what happened? So what happened was that, in my view, is that certain things happened. The public intellectual rapidly became a person that had more often than one foot in academia and another foot in their individual disciplines. And that meant that they relied on a tenureship in a university or another, or a person that was deeply linked to NGOs or civil society. What this means to me is that if you look carefully at the most recent number of Nigerian public intellectuals, it's not hard to see that they're all linked to some form of institution abroad or some form of NGO or civil society, which to me, in a way, frames the argument, you understand? It's hard to see that there's this individual view that is not stained or perverted by a funding agency, be it a university or be it a civil society that is pushing a certain agenda. This is very, very problematic. In terms of cultural purchase, we want to find, the question is, what sort of idea governs the notion of the message of a public intellectual? This brings me to what Mr. Olojede said is, let me quote, what is the Nigerian idea? I remember sitting down with Professor Obumselu. I was very fortunate to have met him. And to me, that was what was paramount in his mind. What is the Nigerian idea? So when you have public intellectuals today that do not believe in Nigeria, have different ideas about the country, it is not easy to understand or trust what they're saying, because what is the bigger Nigerian idea for them? They don't articulate it, neither do they speak about it in lucid language. Yes, it's true that the public intellectual should not speak in jargon, but the Nigerian situation calls for the public intellectuals to take more interest in policy, in a sense, because they cannot advocate change without understanding the nuances of all these ideas. Then we come back to my third issue, location. How and where is this intellectualism being brewed? You understand? It's important to know that the tradition of intellectual engagement requires a system where the young are being brewed. And it reminds me of what Professor Osundare was saying when he says, who is this intellectual? So the intellectual to me is a person that speaks the truth, irrespective of how inconvenient it is. And this has to be a big, this also is part of the question you asked about illiteracy. Today, the reading culture in Nigeria is very embarrassing. Many people don't love reading as before. They are very into social media. So for you to get intellectual engagement, you have to understand the efficacy of books and why books are, a gateway to the human existence or human experience, you understand? So when you have people, a generation that doesn't read, what do they take away from a public message, so to speak? One would say, I disagree with Chimamanda saying that, well, she didn't really say this, but she said, I think public intellectuals have to have a sense of philosophy because it governs politics, economics, sociology, almost every aspect. It doesn't mean that they are philosophers in that sense, but they have to have a sense of philosophy. And the history of philosophy is actually the history of groups or history of networks. So you need networks where people brew intellectual debate, brew intellectual understanding. And then if you look at the West, for instance, almost all public intellectuals belonged to one circle or the other. Then they became whatever they are independently. If you look at Western thought where you have somewhat like 16 circles where people said this idea of European thought or Western thought. We don't have this in this country where there's an intergenerational tradition of passing knowledge or encouraging young people to think in a very analytic way for a better future, or to answer the question of what is the Nigerian idea. So I think parallel to everything would be, what is the Nigerian idea? What's the idea we spoke about? As Achebe said, you understand, there was a country. So what country are we describing? And these are the questions I think the public intellectual has to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is, and to try to carry the younger generation along in telling them the context in terms of history, as Chimamanda said, and also in terms of knowing how to filter between what is fake news and what is relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much. Knowing what is relevant is super important. I think something that's really excited me about the conversations that have been had here today is that we've all kind of come from, the various aspects of our life. Whether it's activism, whether it's, academia, wherever it is we've come from, the media, journalism, and it's just come back to, the thing about intellectualism is not just a big term. It's almost as it were inside us, and it's the things that we do and the things that we say and the ways in which we carry ourselves. Our final contributor for tonight, thank you very much, Mr. Mudi Yahaya. Our final contributor tonight, we're wrapping up back with academia, is Professor Dan Izebaye. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sir, over to you, Professor Dan. Do we have Professor Dan?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir,
Hello?
we can hear you here. Yes, we can hear you.
Let me begin by congratulating those who put this very stimulating program together. I looked forward to this when the program was first announced, especially because the keynote speaker, Chimamanda, never ceases to fulfill the expectations of our audience. And today is not an example. She put her finger on the issues in her very first statement. And I will frame it in my own terms. There are two possible paths to the problem being discussed today. She dealt with one of them, but she did mention the second one. That is, the wise old man of traditional African society. I'm not being romantic here. I will explain what I mean, because in his last days, Obumselu himself tried to develop that idea. And I will try to clarify it in a minute. But let me repeat, in other words, what the keynote speaker has set out. She started with Emerson's scholar, the American scholar. And then she went on to give us an idea of what she thinks. There have been different stages of this. Emerson himself, without saying so explicitly, was indirectly influenced by the Renaissance idea of the ideal scholar. All those artists and intellectuals, the artist who is also a scientist, and also a politician or a political figure, not politician. And Emerson was building on that. So when Chimamanda talked about the activity of the intellectual, he's not just tied up in his study. She was developing the Renaissance idea of the public intellectual as a rounded person who is also active beyond the limits of his ideas. What has followed after that, I think I should point this out. Abiola Irele has a paper called The African Scholar, very much like what Emerson said about the American scholar, where Irele set out what he expects the African scholar to do. Irele was himself very much a public intellectual. The limitation of the present can be traced back to colonial times, in the sense that we had two options in Africa. One, to develop the way we are going, which is along the path already mapped out by colonial education, the kind of education that Obumselu and his contemporaries had at Ibadan. Achebe and the others, Achebe, Obumselu, and the writers of that period. And what was this education? They were well grounded in Western history and Western literature. And we are immersed in the Western worldview and indirectly made to apply this to the African condition. That's why we are having problems now. And when these intellectuals, public intellectuals, to pick two of them, Achebe, Obumselu and Okigbo, when they found that what they were doing wasn't producing results as they expected, they went into politics. They became soldiers. That reflects the modern flaw of the epic model, by which I mean people like Okigbo and Obumselu, we are behaving like epic heroes, trying to do everything in an age of specialization. What they needed was no more than what Chimamanda himself has referred to, a public intellectual who will be in politics without being a politician. Our own professor from Rivers State, who now teaches in Lagos. And she was impressed with him. So we do have models. And there is now a generation after Obumselu following that model. People like Osundare, like Chimamanda himself, and the other participants, except myself, I'm still a scholar in my study. I'm not a public intellectual, but we do have before us public intellectuals that the man who sent in the question can look up to. The Chimamandas, the Patutomis, the Niyi Osundares, the Olojedes, that is, intellectuals as well as people who intervene in the public discourse, and they will gradually produce an effect. Let me go back to what I said was missing from the discourse which Chimamanda referred to. The wise old man of traditional African society. I present this as a concept. I'm not being romantic. I'm not going back to the past as such. Our development was cut short by the colonial intervention, which imposed our worldview, their literature, their culture, their history, even some of their scientific findings on us. That made it possible for us to think of where we are coming from. Of course, history has made it impossible for us to go back to the African past. But you can see it in the writings of people like Wole Soyinka, who seeks a parallel between Yoruba myths and Greek myths, and a parallel between the Yoruba worldview and the Greek worldview. Or Chinua Achebe, who, as we all know, said, we don't need the white man to teach us what culture and civilization is. And then held up a mirror to that traditional past to show what it was like and what we might learn from it. To summarize this point I am making, history had available to us two paths. Africa was moving really rather slowly in terms of modern science, modern industrialization, literacy especially. The West came and imposed this on us. And we took the wrong turning along the path set by the West. And that is part of our problem. And the writer has been trying to bring us back as much as we can. It's rather late. And let me make my second and last point, starting from this, why I say it is rather late. I think Obumselu discovered this later in his career. He didn't write much, just as Okigbo didn't write much, because they spent part of their time as public intellectuals activating their ideas, going into politics, going into the army. And Obumselu did this because he saw that there was no route through the European path that he had been led by his education and by the opportunities in the West to adopt. That is why, in fact, he now spent time going back to educate himself about African countries. That's why he turned, as he himself admitted, a restless, roving scholar who could not stay in Nsukka or stay in Abia State University, but would go to Southern Africa, go to Ghana, and left the classic text of the West to try to understand these oral traditions of Africa, the Bongo of South Africa, the praise poems of the cattle herders of Southern Africa. This was the second stage of his development as a public intellectual, because he had now seen that that path, adopting the Western worldview, could only do so much. And that was why he was forced to go into politics, forced by historical circumstances to go into the army, just like Okigbo. It is the model of the hero of the epic. Of course, in the traditional epic, the hero achieved his goal. He's extremely gifted, much more gifted than others of his age. And Obumselu was. You find only one or two people like Obumselu in a generation. Look at his writing. Those names, African thinkers, African authors, European thinkers, European authors, whether it's English or French or Greek, he wasn't dropping names. This was not name dropping. This was the typical talent of the ideal hero of the epic in quest of salvation for his race. Unfortunately for Echero, the world has become too complex. The old models are no longer effective. The specialization which Western knowledge has now discovered and made universal. I'm a lecturer in literature in English. You are an artist. And there are boundaries between these. The paths don't cross. The old Renaissance figure was not like that. And that brings me to that point that Chimamanda made. The wise old man. We no longer have them. People are just being opportunistic by saying, I'm older than you are. We've gone beyond the age of the wise old man of traditional society, because those wise old men won respect not because of their age, but because of experience arising from their specialized crafts. The hunter, the blacksmith knows more about the hunt than anybody else, knows about the herbs in the forest. He was a zoologist, he was a botanist, he was a hunter. He knew the anatomy of the animals. And when he displays his knowledge in the village, he wins respect. I cannot now say to a doctor, medical doctor, oh, you should respect me when I talk about headache. The age has gone beyond that. Respect is no longer won merely because of gray hair. The public intellectual puts his knowledge in service of society, but there are limits because this is an age of specialization. Osundare will not, I am sure of that, take up arms to fight if there is a problem somewhere in our public space. He will do what is best equipped to do. So we still have public intellectuals. We have them contributing to this very lively discourse today. And they have brought out from his study a scholar who does not claim to be a public intellectual, contributing to this public debate. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you so much for sharing these words of wisdom with us. Just having, going through my marching orders with the rest of the planning team, and everyone is just going on and on and on about the amount of wisdom and the amount of just knowledge we've had in the room today. So thank you so much, sir, for sharing your thoughts on this subject. Really appreciate you coming, really appreciate you staying, and thank you for speaking with us this evening. All right, thank you very much, sir. We're now going to listen to members of the audience. We want to hear what people's thoughts on the public intellectual, or the intellectual and public service in 21st century Africa. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your own musings on this subject. I was originally supposed to share a few words, but let's be honest with ourselves, you cannot follow anything that has just been said. And so I guess the only thing I will add to the conversation that's already been had is that there are opportunities for us to find, this intellectual. There are opportunities for us. A bunch of things have really stood out for me. One of them is seeking knowledge. One of them is even understanding context and nuance. I've also heard about values. I've heard about research. I've heard about context. I've also heard about just, the constant reflection and the constant reminders that we must continue to do to ensure that we are towing the path that stands as inspiration for others. I want to invite a few people to say a few words. I know that a number of people have had their hands up and have wanted to say some things. I'm going to be leaning very heavily on the technical team to support me. And so can I ask that if you have a comment to make, can you please put your hand up, and the technical team will help us unmute people as we go along. Can I plead, however, that people keep their comments to a maximum of 90 seconds, just so we can accommodate as many as we possibly can. Finally, just to apologize that we have now gone over this meeting by 8 minutes. The event was supposed to end at 6 o'clock on the dot, but we have gone over by approximately 8 minutes. So yes, I'll go through a few questions while I wait on the technical team to spotlight a number of people. As mentioned earlier, there are a number of questions for our keynote speaker. I'll take a couple of them and we'll see about bringing her back to respond to some of these questions. And this one is from Abubakar Joji. He says, is it a cultural issue that makes the older ones not want to give the younger ones a chance to lead or learn on the job? In the universities, for instance, the profs and older ones have found a way to remain exclusive in areas and fields by not properly mentoring the younger ones. What can be done to address this in the wider context, not just academia? There's another question on the role of the diaspora. Can getting leadership right in Nigeria be realistic without the contribution of the diaspora public intellectual? And there's a lot of comments. This one says, the tragedy of our present situation is the public intellectual has been so compromised that he or she has become the main problem. We must strive to develop a new generation of public intellectuals, just as we struggle to build a new Nigeria. There are comments for our speakers. One of them says, I have followed Ayo Obe since she was a kid. She epitomizes truth always. Let history become a compulsory subject in all spheres of our lives and livelihoods. There's more comments. One of them says, Prof, I think when Chimamanda raised the alarm about role models to this generation, perhaps she took a walk to our public schools where the vast majority of this generation exists. It appears that women and men who are supposed to be role models are busy modeling them into extortion, sexual harassment, and other vices. The young people are looking for scarce role models. So I'm just going to go back to, there's quite a few comments. I'll invite people in the audience to please look in the comment section or in the Q&A section and feel free to engage with others who are currently in this event. I can't see any hands up yet. So I think this is a good time to go to Mr. Chuma. Mr. Chuma Obumselu, in the event that we don't have any more comments or any people who want to speak. I was told a few people wanted to make comments, but I haven't seen any hands up that the technical team can bring up for us.
Well,
right, we can actually see some hands up. Okay. So do we take, okay, I've actually seen quite a few hands up. All right, so do we start with Abi Alao? Do we start with Abi Alao?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please go on.
Awesome. Thank you very much to the panel. I just want to, I'm a voice from diaspora. I'm a lecturer in Plymouth. It's not a place where you have many of our people, but Chimamanda Adichie, I honor you. My elder, Professor Niyi Osundare, the last time he was invited to my university to speak. What I want to say is concerning our country, I think getting students to really look at the work that's gone before them, you know, the work of these intellectuals, I think is very important. I remember introducing the Half of a Yellow Sun to my university. My colleagues were up in arms at some point. I said, this book has to be read. And for the 11 years I taught at the university, it was on the reading list. Niyi Osundare's poems on the reading list. Soyinka's play on the reading list. But the thing we enjoyed, it was the conversation around these books. And I taught 100% white students, but to bring the issues that we have in Nigeria and the culture and the intellectuals that wrote these books to discuss what their hearts are and where their hearts are, I think it changed the community a lot. Now let's take it to Nigeria. I believe that we have—
Can you wrap up on your comments, please?
Yeah, we have intellectuals, we have people who have gone before us, we have these role models that I've mentioned, Professor Zebaye, and I think that getting their works to be discussed properly in these universities will open the students up to what they need to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And next, I'm going to go to Philip Njemanze. Philip Njemanze. Philip Njemanze, are you ready?
Yes, I can. Okay. Can you hear me?
Please go on.
Yes. My greetings to all the panelists and distinguished people. I think the most important thing Ngozi spoke about is that the intellectuals are the voice of the voiceless. Now, do you know that in Nigeria today, that they have passed a law that you can take the organ as a medical doctor? I could take your organ without consent. And it's law since 2014. So I would like to recruit all of you, all the distinguished panelists, all the intellectuals on this, to actually speak out on this, because our people will die in their millions. Femi Falana is talking about it. I've talked about it. Please, the links are on the Q&A. So this is the type of voice you need to give power to. And this is what will save our nation, because this is pretty serious. The National Assembly sold the organs of Nigerians. And you are the only people who can speak out very loudly on this. So if you go to the Q&A, you will see the links, read some of the articles, and you can take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Philip Njemanze. Thank you for your comments. I'm just going to go back to our keynote speaker, Chimamanda Adichie, to provide responses to any of the questions or comments that have come up. And then we'll go to Chuma Obumselu for closing comments and a thank you to everyone. So back to our keynote speaker. Muted.
Must have come first in school because of how quickly you grasp the major ideas that everyone has brought up. I think it's been interesting listening to everyone, and I find that I'm learning. I feel inspired. I want to thank in particular, because I think he in fact is a representation of the idea he talked about, of the wise old man in Africa. Professor is by whose name I hope I'm pronouncing properly, and whose name I have known for so long. And I've actually read some of your writings, sir. And so it's such an honor. I think maybe if I, just to respond to two things. The first is this idea of nuance, which of course I think is important, but I also think that it's important not to get that you know, Patotomi's, the example I use about Patotomi, I think is effective, not because it tells the full story, but that it starts to illuminate for somebody who has no idea what this question of restructuring and devolution of powers means. It's a very kind of sort of pithy way of giving a person an idea of what that means. And so I don't think that the two ideas are necessarily opposed to each other. I think that one can believe in and understand and advocate for the importance of nuance, while at the same time recognizing that there are situations in which that kind of full nuance is not possible and can also and be equally effective. I think that's maybe all. I feel really inspired. I want to thank Dele Olojede. I want to really thank everyone who's spoken. And I could not help but think that everyone who's spoken somehow seemed to illustrate the larger idea of what we are in fact talking about. And I feel inspired, and I was making notes, and I want to go off and now read more about everyone who spoke. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I think just thank you for sharing your words. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. Like I said, I'm a very big fan, and I think that just having this conversation on, you know, the intellectual and public service in 21st century Africa, I think, you know, the choice of you as our keynote speaker was one that's like super timely, because this is a fierce and this is an urgent conversation that needs to be had. I'm going to go now to Chioma for thank yous and acknowledgements, and then we'll call it a day. Chioma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chioma. So I don't have the eloquence of all our guests, so I've taken the precaution of writing down my thank you note, and I hope you'll allow me to read it. So basically, on behalf of the family and organizers, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone, to my dear friend, the courageous and gracious Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Thank you for bravely tackling a subject that could be easily dismissed as ephemeral, but never for a moment sounding ephemeral. You have been richly blessed, and you're using your talents amazingly well, and we can't thank you enough for a truly wonderful lecture. To our panel, Dele Olojede, who said yes instantly and offered every assistance, to Professor Osundare and Professor Isidore, who have been so gracious with their time, and Ayo Obe, who reassuringly informed us from the onset that she was no intellectual, and to Malam Mudi Yahaya, my good friend, who always asks hard questions. Thank you for all your time, your insights, for sharing your experiences with us, and for greatly enriching the discussion. To Professor Diala for his lovely tribute to our father, thank you. To our moderator, Chioma, Agwuegbo. You came highly recommended and you did not disappoint. Thank you for your skillful handling of this event. We'd also like to thank the TISO Foundation for the support in promoting the event in Southern and Central Africa. TISO is a self-sustaining benefit organization focused on supporting youth and education and developing African potential. Of course, thank you to our amazing audience across Nigeria, Central and Southern Africa, the US and Europe. Thank you for taking 2 hours on a busy day, actually over 2 hours on a busy day, to tune in and think about Professor Obumselu and some of the things that matter to him. We hope the discussion will not end here. It's essentially not a new topic or conversation, but I guess we feel every generation and time has the duty to continue it and to advance it. So thank you for doing this. See you next year.
Thank you very much, Chioma. Good night, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you. How was it? Yeah.